Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Ruth McCambridge, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Nonprofit Quarterly, and I'm so glad that you're joining us here today for this very special workshop on endowments and reserves. I always like to start with the reserves first and then the endowments. But we're going to talk today just what their use is strategically, how they're defined, and a little bit about the way that we'd like to kind of bring them into more common discourse between grantees and funders, which we think is critically important for the health of organizations. When we're talking about reserves, it really, I think that in the best of times, we are only thinking about how best to do our work. Where can we spend the money most wisely to get the biggest impact? And we tend to forget that sometimes things can go wrong. An expected grant doesn't come in. Something goes wrong in your program. You have to pay legal costs. Other kinds of things like that. Some of that is stuff that, of course, you could go to a friendly funder for in a panic, but maybe that's not something you want to do. I'm always reminded when we're talking about reserves and endowments and working capital of an article that was written for us ages ago by Woods Bowman called Goldilocks and the Three Budgets. And he said that, a nonprofit sector is naturally frugal. And for a lot of us, we kind of expect that we're going to spend every penny we have on making our programs as good as they can be. But in the long run, that doesn't create stable organizations that are able to pick up opportunities and make the most out of crises when they happen. And so what he said is that, you can both have way too little money when you're faced with an opportunity or a crisis, or way too much money, which you somehow, cushions you against the world. But what you want to have is just the right amount of money. And so reserves are definitely a part of that. They smooth out the rough spots and allow us to function even in what can feel like some very desperate times. At this point, we're talking under this administration about certain agencies being cut. I'm laughing, but it's not funny. That was a dark laugh. But it can be terrifying. I was in an organization myself that lost 90% of its funding in over a 3-month period because an agency was cut in the Reagan era. So these are serious considerations. We have what can only be described as a superstar team today to talk to us about reserves and endowments. And we're talking to funders as well as to grantees at this time. So for all those funders that are in our audience, a special welcome. Think carefully about how you can integrate this into your next grant making cycle. So many of you already know, first let me say that you can ask us a question at any point during this broadcast. Even if it's a clarifying question, I may ask it in the middle of the broadcast. If it's a question that we'll bring up later in the question period, I'll just hold it until then to make sure that it hasn't already been answered. But I want to welcome Hilda Polanco, who is a frequent facilitator and presenter on our webinar, and for good reason. She's one of the best minds in the sector when it comes to financial matters. We depend on her absolutely to help us understand the complexities of various changes in financial environment and in the ways that we can manage our own systems. We're also excited to welcome two representatives of the Greater New Orleans Foundation, Joanne Ritchie and Kelly Chavez Green. Joanne develops, designs, and leads programs and learning activities to build and strengthen the capacity and effectiveness of nonprofits to more successfully meet their missions. And Kelly designs and implements implements learning opportunities for nonprofits, and works to increase the effectiveness of the foundation's grant making. They've been working with Melissa Sawyer at the Youth Empowerment Project, which engages underserved young people through community-based programs to build their skills and strengthen community ties. Melissa has garnered widespread recognition for her leadership in the youth development and juvenile justice fields. Now on to Hilda, Joanne, Kelly, and Melissa. And thank you so much for being here and doing this with us today.
Our pleasure.
Hilda?
Yes, I'd like to go on to our presentation. If you could advance to our first slide, that would be wonderful. I wanted to start just by presenting a bit of a framing to this conversation today. The idea of reserves versus endowments comes up often, and when we work with organizations, we are big advocates of reserves rather than endowments as an option for flexibility. So if you could just help me by advancing the slide. The reserves concept is something that is available for sustaining operations during unexpected changes. It is your nest egg. It is what you want to have available for things that haven't necessarily been planned. The endowment concept is next part of the slide. It's a fund that's made up of donations that are subject to requirement that the principal never be touched and that it be maintained intact and invested so that revenue can be generated for the benefit of the organization. So think of the operating reserves as a flexible reserve pool, and think of endowment as principal in perpetuity, which is a term you may have heard, and only earnings from the endowment can be made available. And historically, I think individuals, donors, and foundations who have wanted to support nonprofits for the long term would automatically assume that the only option was endowment. Well, today we want to orient you to some thinking and some examples where the long term is in fact being funded by the creation of what we call operating reserves. On our next slide, I want to introduce you to the concept of capital for change and security. Think of that as the concept for why do we need reserves. We need reserves because we change as organizations and we want to ensure our long-term security. I have here for you 3 different types of capital, and later I'll talk about a resource that goes into these ideas much more detail. But the idea of capital for change and security covers 3 different areas that we see often organizations needing support in. One would be capital for the creation of an operating reserve that is for liquidity, for security, for unexpected delays in payments. And as you know, here at FMA, we value the term LUNA, liquid unrestricted net assets, as a key metric for financial health and financial sustainability. So one reason to have reserves would be to create a LUNA balance that really supports your ongoing operations. Another possibility for a reserve might be for facilities purposes, maintaining and replacing those facilities for when you need to have them available and not be at risk that when you need them, you will not have the funds. And the third type of reserve example is this idea of change capital. And for many of you who are on a growth trajectory, or for the funders who are joining us who are funding growth, you often hear about change capital campaign and how nonprofits need funds to go from where they are today to where they'd like to be. And those are typically either through a growth and expansion initiative, maybe innovation. They'd like to test new ideas that have not yet had an outcome that has evidence behind it, so that it's sort of in an incubation period. Or for organizations that have struggled with financial results, sometimes the reserve just replenishes their resources to be able to continue operating. Often the question we have from organizations is, what's my strategy? How do I build a reserve? And on the next slide, I want to show 3 different strategies that we see be very successful. An organization, first let me say that the only way to create a reserve is to have more revenue than expenses. That's the secret. We need to raise enough dollars to cover our expenses and have funds left over for the creation of the reserve. We can do that through every year. We could say if we have a surplus, we will designate that to reserves. In essence, we work and we plan and we have a board-approved budget that calls for a surplus, and we are putting that towards the reserve. Another option might be we have a line item in the budget that says current year addition to reserves. It's a more innovative way of thinking about it, used less often, but very impactful. When you make the choice that you'll have an operating line in your budget, current year addition to reserve, that means you've prioritized it almost as equally as salaries or travel or supplies. The reserve is equally as important. So that budgetary line item tells the reader, meaning the board or outside stakeholders, we really believe that this reserve is critical. And yet there's still a third strategy, which we're calling a targeted foundation investment. And what this means is it's really a partnership between a nonprofit and a funder that believes in their long-term future, that wants to support the sustainability of the organization and wants to consider making a grant specifically earmarked for the creation of the reserves. We work with funders and nonprofits nationally, and through the years have identified funders who have actually brought this strategy into their grant making strategy. And one of those funders that we've worked with and have really been really pleased to see their focus with reserves is the Greater New Orleans Foundation. And today I have with me two representatives that you heard at the beginning of the webinar, Joanne and Kelly from the foundation. And we also have Melissa from the Youth Empowerment Project, who I will now, from this point forward, call YEP, for me to ask a few questions and really learn about how they came to create what they called the Freeman Challenge. I was extremely impressed to see that it wasn't a grant just when one organization would ask for it, but actually it is the very nature of the grant. It is a pool. It is available for folks who apply. But instead of me telling you what the Freeman Challenge grant is, I wanted to ask a few questions of Joanne and Kelly that will introduce what is this grant, what is this challenge, notice the name challenge in the title, and what was some of the impact that this Freeman Challenge has had on their grant making. So I want to start by saying, asking, how did the challenge start? What was the funding originally? You have given me some background and mentioned that it wasn't originally for this purpose. It actually evolved to this strategy. How did we go from the original strategy to what the strategy is today?
Great, thank you, Hilda. And this is Kelly Chavez Green speaking. The Richard West Freeman Endowment Challenge Fund is an endowed donor advised fund held at the Community Foundation. The fund was established in 2000 as a matching grant for the purpose of assisting nonprofit organizations in establishing and/or building endowments, educating the nonprofit sector and the donor community on the importance of building financial independence to ensure long-term financial stability, and providing organizations a predictable source of income. In 2012, the program officer over the fund and the committee began to notice a decline in applications for the Endowment Challenge. Organizations that were accepted into the challenge were opting out or not meeting their fundraising goals. Organizations that did reach their fundraising goals for the Endowment Challenge reported falling short on their fundraising goals for operations that year. And those organizations with an endowment were averaging less than 1% of interest yielded annually. As such, they were not investing or growing their endowment. It is important to note, as we were noticing these challenges in the challenge, we were also, as a foundation, establishing an organizational effectiveness initiative. All of these factors together presented an opportunity for us to assess the endowment challenge's effectiveness in living into its intended purpose and to better understand nonprofit needs. So, as the community foundation, we felt that it was time to, again, do an assessment and take a closer look at some of the challenges that we were noticing and the barriers. And so what we did, the organizational effectiveness team, working with the grant-making team and the funds committee, we mounted a comprehensive assessment of the program. We conducted a survey followed by focus groups with both past grantees, applicants, as well as key nonprofits in our community. And through those surveys and the focus groups, we learned that most organizations were unclear on an endowment's restrictions. They were often seeking out the endowment as a way to generate revenue for operations and didn't realize the level of investment that was needed to achieve a meaningful disbursement from the endowment. Organizations also did not have the capacity or the infrastructure to mount a fundraising campaign for an endowment. For example, many of the organizations reported not having a fund development plan, not having an individual donor base, that board engagement in fund development was a challenge, and that they really lacked communications capacity around their development efforts. We also learned that most respondents were undercapitalized and did not have a reserve. And to us, that indicated a lack of readiness for an endowment. So our learning led us and the committee to recast the challenge to include a board-restricted reserve component and a capacity building component with an emphasis on building readiness.
Thank you, Kelly. And I just wanted to emphasize the point of an endowment being principal in perpetuity, never to be touched. So when Kelly talks about organizations start an endowment campaign and they start to see a drop in their unrestricted fundraising, not exactly the unintended consequence that one would hope, but one we see often. In order to just better understand what are these components of the program and what does it mean to have a challenge, maybe you could say a little bit more about the components themselves that lead to the challenge grant.
Sure. So as I've indicated, the board restricted reserve challenge is part of an endowment challenge. So there's two opportunities with this particular initiative. They are matching grants where the fund provides $1 for every $2 raised, and there's 3 levels of funding in the board restricted category that organizations could apply for. So for example, on the lower end, nonprofits can select to raise $10,000 and the foundation through the funds would match it with $5,000. On the higher end, nonprofits that choose to raise $30,000 would be matched with a $15,000 grant. And so that would lead to a $45,000 reserve, which is really exciting. The program is on a 2-year cycle, alternating between the readiness and grant-making year and the fundraising year, which is the time that nonprofits are actually raising the match. There is a readiness workshop in the first quarter of the readiness grant-making year called Are You Ready for an Endowment? The workshop is a prerequisite to apply for the grant. So only those organizations that attend the readiness workshop can actually apply for the challenges. The workshop is really designed to demystify the purpose and restrictions of both an endowment and a board-restricted reserve. We teach the capacities, the infrastructure, and the readiness, including fiscal health, that needs to be in place to successfully mount an endowment or reserve campaign. Attendees in the workshop complete a readiness checklist aligned with these capacities, determine their readiness as well as which challenge is the best fit for them. What we have found through these workshops is the vast majority of attendees quickly realize that they are not ready for an endowment or that an endowment is not right for their business model. The board-restricted reserve is a better strategy for their financial needs and goals, and it's really cool to see that sort of light bulb go off during the workshop. Following the workshop, we provide a series of capacity building trainings leading up to the request for proposals for the challenge to help build readiness. Topics in these workshops have included designing a reserve campaign and engaging board members in making the ask. The idea behind the checklist and these follow-up workshops is to build capacity to engage and execute a fundraising campaign for either an endowment or a board-restricted reserve. The RFP launches in September, so organizations have had all this time to get ready as they prepare their applications for the grant. Applicants selected, they select the level of challenge that they will pursue during the application process, and they are required to submit a copy of the readiness checklist as well as a board resolution and policy for the board-restricted reserve that includes a policy and procedure for replenishing the reserve if it is tapped into. And again, in the workshops, we provide them with templates and tools and information on how to engage the board through that process.
Hilda, this is Joanne. Kelly's remarks make me think about why the technical assistance workshops. Well, a couple of reasons. We really felt that when we looked at the survey data from all the past grant recipients who either were successful or were not as successful as they had hoped for, that they were operating under some wrongful assumptions, and we really felt it was important to be able to ready them for and prepare them for success. And as Kelly also mentioned, this is one piece of a larger portfolio of capacity building experiences that we offer for our grantee partners. So we really relied on the data to tell us how could we improve this grant making experience, not only for the donor, but more importantly for our grantee partners.
And we really recognized it as a win when organizations self-selected out of the challenge.
Yep.
And just to give you an example, this year we had about 60 organizations go through the workshops and the process, and we had about 18 or so applications. What we do hear from organizations is although they did not apply for the challenge, the learning from the workshops and the checklist generated lots of conversations at their organizations, and that perhaps in the future they might be ready for either of these opportunities.
And the cool thing about those conversations were they weren't just at the staff level. Oftentimes they were being brought back to the board to really explain and engage in generative conversations with the board about why we're not ready, or maybe in a couple of years we can be ready, but we heard about this cool idea about a board reserve. So it started planting seeds for future development and really being thoughtful and engaged in what it would take to mount either a successful board reserve campaign or endowment.
And I would say almost a third of workshop attendees have been board members, and we strongly encourage teams to come to these workshops that were comprised of the executive director, the development director, and a board member, because it was often those folks, particularly board members, that were calling for the endowment. So just to wrap up how the challenge culminates, challenge finalists are selected in December by the grants committee, which is comprised of the donors' family members and board members from the Greater New Orleans Foundation. And then the following year is the fundraising year. and finalists have 12 months to raise the match. During that fundraising year, we do convene the finalists in a quarterly learning community so that they can share their best and promising practices and problem solve any fundraising barriers. The program finally culminates with a celebration luncheon with the grantees, the committee, and other family members.
And we found that this learning community approach really networks these nonprofits. I want to say unintended, but it really is intended impact of this too, is it brings people together who are not only learning from one another about, oh my gosh, that worked for you. You mind if I try that out in my campaign? And there's a camaraderie and a togetherness with nonprofits. But these are nonprofits that are coming from various sectors in the community, sometimes youth development like YEP, but other times, it could be arts, it could be human service agencies. And so there's really a more strengthened nonprofit sector, and they're much more cohesive and together. And some connections that would never have been formed were formed because of this learning community.
Thank you, Joanne. And I realized that there are many stakeholders in this initiative. And one of the things that struck me when I first learned about the program is the fact that the funder for this program is a donor-advised fund, which I think many community foundations have a significant number. And often there's this question of how can we engage our donor-advised funds holders more in connecting them with the strategy of the foundation, in supporting the community more broadly. So I would love for you to share with us, how has this shift from the original idea of an endowment to what is now more focused on reserves, how has this shift really impacted the donor and how that family thinks about their impact in the sector and how they think about the role that their fund is playing with regard to the community?
Thanks, Hilda. The shift in focus didn't happen overnight, as Kelly alluded to. It was like over a 2-year period. We actually suspended the challenge period while we were working internally and with our board and this donor. So together, our organizational effectiveness staff and our grant-making staff worked with the data that Kelly referred to. And that was both qualitative and quantitative data from those historical Freeman Challenge grantees to really help reframe the story of what was working and what needed a little help to increase the impact and intent of the donor. Because really, we wanted to make sure that the Freeman family kept to the original intent, which was really to support nonprofits so that they could be stable and sustainable. So we were able to tell stories about what helped to the family, to the committee, the family committee, or what frankly hindered nonprofits from living into that donor's original vision, which really we told we told some success stories, and we said, look, there were some that weren't successful. And that was really eye-opening for the funder. And what we also shared was that the nonprofits felt that while, as Kelly said, endowments were wonderful, they recognized that not every organization needed one. Rather, they were starting to look, the nonprofits in aggregate were starting to say, reserve funds could really help us to be more nimble, more flexible, and more planful. And once the family members heard these messages from us and the nonprofits, they really had to do a little bit of reflection and soul searching, and they began to amend their own assumptions and beliefs about what they thought nonprofits needed. And they were more able to clearly recognize that board reserves could actually expand the impact of the challenge. And they got really excited about that. They also recognized that they needed to learn a bit about the board reserve concept because they were uncertain about that. And so we actually had some mini work sessions during committee meetings to help them better understand what a reserve could do for an organization who may not be ready. And that, you know, what you alluded to, Hilda, around liquidity and security for that sort of those unexpected needs and a way to be much more nimble. And we also helped them craft a policy for replenishment because they were concerned, and rightfully so, that what if we invest in these nonprofits and they spend down the reserve and then sort of the money goes away and then it's, you know. So we talked with them and helped come to a happy medium about developing some sample policies and criteria for how the nonprofit would replenish the reserve, and they were really thrilled about that. So this was really a learning and growth opportunity for the donor. And with the addition of the technical assistance workshops that Kelly mentioned, we opened the family's understanding to the importance of a different type of capacity building, because they were thinking endowments, but now they're actually funding the actual workshops that Kelly talked about. So they now have an expanded view of what philanthropy, what they're giving could actually fund. And in fact, the chair of the committee was so excited about the notion of technical assistance workshops that she attended 2 of the workshops to better get a feeling for what we were offering, what are the needs of the nonprofits. And she's become a stronger advocate for our capacity building work because of this hands-on experience. And the education process helped solidify a shared understanding and approach to the Freeman Challenge by all family members that were on the committee, as well as our board representative. And I would say that we were able to connect, as Kelly said, the board reserve and the endowment awards recipients at a donors luncheon with the challenge committee. And the donors recognized in the stories that those recipients were able to tell about how they successfully met the challenge, that they were able to see all along what was their original vision, which is a strong, stable, and effective nonprofit. I guess the cherry on the top of what the impact to the donor was is this is a family effort. And I would say that the committee had been, for a long time, historically comprised of older generation members. And so when they started talking about this new and expanded Freeman Challenge with the board reserve, with the workshops, with the luncheon, new and younger family members started getting excited. And as such, you know, at family gatherings and reunions, they talked about it. And now we've expanded to the second generation. So it's been I'd say a win-win for the foundation, the nonprofits, and certainly the donor.
Thank you, Joanne. And I realize that as a community foundation that has emphasized organizational effectiveness in the way that you do, a lot of the work you do is focused on building the capacity of grantees. But I wondered, after having had the experience of this particular challenge grant, do you feel that that has actually spilled over into your general grant making and increased the idea of reserves as a strategy for grant making overall for the foundation?
Well, I think certainly this initiative has influenced how we're thinking about our grant making more broadly. I think the biggest influence is how we're telling our stories to our donors and to current donors, donor advised fund holders that could, who might want to join us in thinking more broadly about where and how to invest their dollars, and generally telling our stories, the story of impact. So we've updated our website to talk a little bit more about the challenge. There's a little microsite on our foundation's website, which is now dedicated to the challenge. It features what the family is trying to do and stories of success from our nonprofit partners. We featured this work in an annual report, which goes to all of our stakeholders, donors, and partners, all locally, regionally, and nationally. And we've connected the nonprofits who were awarded the challenge with the donors who made this possible. And that's been a shift. And that shift has shown up in some recent work that we've done in launching an LGBT fund. We use data to identify the needs of the nonprofits, much like we did with the Freeman Challenge. And we worked with key donors who wanted to start this fund so that from the get-go, all stakeholder interests and needs would be met. And I think, finally, we've elevated the role of capacity building through this grant-making effort, and we've reinforced the notion with our grant-making staff that capacity building it can strengthen the grant-making process and really produce more impactful outcomes for our institutions, our donors, and our grantee partners. This partnership that Kelly led has helped spawn more cross-collaboration between our organizational effectiveness and our grant-making department, and quite frankly, other departments in the foundation, because we're working with donor relations, we're working with our finance department. They play a key role in this effort. And so we're all working together in a much more integrated way, I believe, because of this. And in fact, we brought in our CFO to lead a portion of the technical assistance workshop. So ultimately, that was great for us. It was a great collaboration, and he's a terrific presenter, I have to say. And we're also improving our clients' experience, whether that's our grantee partners or our donors.
Thank you, Joanne. That's wonderful. I'd like to turn the conversation now to Melissa, who is joining us from YEP, the Youth Empowerment Project. And Melissa, I really would appreciate if you would just share with us briefly a little bit about the organization, its size, history, and if there were any financial challenges that the organization was facing as you embarked on this journey towards the creation of the reserve. Would be great to hear about it. I have a feeling some of our audience today may relate to some of the challenges. So please share some of those with us.
All right, great. Yeah, it's wonderful to be with you, and thanks to Kelly and Joanne for their investment and their leadership in this work. I'm Melissa Sawyer. I'm a co-founder, one of 3 co-founders of the Youth Empowerment Project and the executive director. YEP was founded 1 year before Hurricane Katrina in 2004. And when we started, we operated one program that was the first and only juvenile reentry program in the state of Louisiana, working with young people who were incarcerated and under the care and custody of the State Office of Juvenile Justice. YEP really came into existence in the wake of the juvenile justice reform of Louisiana in 2003, again, recognizing the need to move the state toward one that focused resources on supporting young people in their communities, as opposed to relying on incarceration. During our first year of operation, we had the one reentry program, 5 employees. We served 25 young people, and we had an annual operating budget of about $235,000. Over the past 14 years now, we have had significant growth. We currently are the largest and most comprehensive youth-serving organization in New Orleans, focused on opportunity youth, young people ages 16 to 24 who are disconnected from school and work, at-risk young people, and young people who have court engagement. However, only about 33% of the young people we serve annually now do have any juvenile or criminal justice involvement. We operate 11 programs today that we fit into 4 different buckets: YEP Mentors, YEP Educates, YEP Enriches, and YEP Works. So an array of mentoring, community-based education, high school equivalency instruction, enrichment programming, which is out-of-school time programming, and Works, which is employment readiness training, where we have 3 youth-driven businesses, and Connection to Employment, providing young people with skills they need to enter and retain employment. We currently have about 50 staff. We serve about 1,200 young people, and we have approximately a $4 million budget. In terms of financial challenges, I think that, you know, speaking to the choir, if there's nonprofit folks on the phone, that, you know, it's a difficult sector to do good work, but also really feel like you have a strong financial foothold. Probably like many of you, we rely heavily on philanthropy. We have since our inception. Only about 25% of our funding comes through public funding sources. In some ways, that's inherent in the work that we do, really focused on young people who, by definition, are disconnected from systems, which means that there is little system-level responsibility for funding programs that serve those young people. And also, we serve young people during out-of-school time hours, so there's not a lot of more traditional public funding streams to support them. We have only one Fortune 500 company in New Orleans, and we have, therefore, a dearth of corporate investment in the work that we are supporting here in our community. Also, as we've seen the ebbs and flows in Louisiana, for example, with the oil and gas industry, that has also meant that there have been fluctuations in terms of the reliability and also the size of corporate investment. We have a very, very generous, but a relatively small individual donor base in New Orleans, like I'm sure many of you do, especially in sort of mid-sized markets. And in New Orleans, we have an imbalance because of the size of the social challenges that we're facing and the level of economic inequity and challenges we face in terms of poverty and disconnection and incarceration, yet we do not have the individual donor base to correlate with that. We have, in the past 5 years, built up our income generating itself in terms of providing some professional development and technical assistance to other organizations. And also our 3 youth-driven businesses now generate almost 25% of the revenue we need to operate our youth employment programming. But again, kind of talking through those 5 buckets of philanthropy, public funding, corporate investment, individual donors, and income generating strategies, I think we know too well that we never have enough funding, and you have to continually be focused on diversifying where you are getting your funding from in order to have a strong and solvent organization.
And so I guess the question I would have for you is what prompted the idea of joining the challenge? How did the board think about it? What was that like to get the board to say this is a priority and let's go for it? Let's go for the application.
So collectively, over the past several years, I've worked really closely with my board, and I have to say that I am so delighted with the shape of and the engagement of YEP's board at this point in time, but it also has taken significant investment of time and true intentionality about building that board. So with the board, our primary focus has been and will continue to be about the sustainability and health of the organization. In fact, we established 3 guiding tenets for this year, which was strengthening YEP's infrastructure and operations, formalizing our internal processes and data and evaluation systems, and diversifying our funding streams. So when this opportunity came to us, it seemed like it actually was a perfect fit throughout all 3 of those tenets, where we are really building to strengthen ourselves as an organization, formalizing how we are going to be spending our resources, and then also diversifying where we are accessing funding and the types of funding we are accessing. For several years, I've had at least one, but several of my board members really pushing us to consider starting an endowment. As you know, Kelly and Joanne alluded to earlier, I had been hesitant to do that for several reasons. One, we are 14 years old, which in many ways is still a pretty young organization. 2, year in and year out, because of the lack of multi-year commitments and really true sustained funding, it's hard to know whether or not we will be able to raise the funds we need to cover our operating costs and programmatic costs year in and year out. As such, telling a donor that we don't need their resources for our annual operating expenses really felt like a stretch if I knew that those dollars would be inaccessible to us and we very may need them for programming or for operations. So as such, when we had the opportunity to apply for the board restricted cash reserve, it seemed like a perfect sort of happy medium where we could be really focused on building our sustainability and strengthening ourselves as an organization. But if need be, and with the board's blessing based on the development of a board restricted policy, we would be able to access the funds that we needed to cover unforeseen costs, including in our case, capital expenses and repairs, as we are fortunate enough to own 3 buildings, but the maintenance of those buildings is something where we have found there are unforeseen circumstances.
Absolutely. And Melissa, I guess I'd like to ask, there's a special element to this program, which is the challenge. So it's the foundation putting forth those funds, but then saying you need to meet the challenge. So what was your strategy to meet the challenge? How did the board approach that?
Right, so I sort of put this back on the board a little bit. I felt like if this is being called a board restricted reserve, that the board had a responsibility to step up and to therefore make this their initiative. I think it was an exciting way to get them involved, for them to feel a sense of ownership, but also that if I needed to ask their permission to tap into this money for emergency costs, that I really wanted them to have some skin in the game in terms of how we were going to raise those funds. So the board was 100% on board. They were really committed to this initiative. I think for us, we did apply for the largest board restricted cash reserve option that the foundation provided us, which was to raise $30,000, and then we would receive a $15,000 match. We actually initially had a much more complicated strategy for fundraising, but like many nonprofits, we had transition on our development team. And therefore, due to just the time and capacity and our willingness to really focus on closing out our fiscal year responsibly in terms of our operational costs and program costs, we decided to take advantage of another wonderful opportunity that the Greater New Orleans Foundation sponsors, which is Give NOLA Day. And this is a citywide day of giving that the Greater New Orleans Foundation facilitates to raise awareness around grantee partners and to encourage everyone in the community to make a gift of $10 or more that then would be matched by the generous donations and supporters of the foundation. And so we had the idea that we would put it out there to our supporters, big and small, to help support us on Give NOLA Day, to help us meet our goal in one day. And I'm delighted to say that we did in fact satisfy the goal, in large part because our president of the board and vice president of the board co-penned a letter that was sent out to all of our supporters, asking them to join the board in making YEP a long-term sustainable organization that would help young people for many, many years to come. And people responded, they rose to the challenge, and in addition to raising the $30,000, we actually raised an additional $20,000 that we can use for our programming expenses.
That's such a wonderful sort of matching concept between the general public, the board, and this one fund. And just one final question, Melissa. Now that the board reserve exists, how do you feel that that will impact the decision making for the team, sort of your day-to-day business choices you make?
So the way I lead is through relatively conservative financial, I guess, an approach. So I actually don't think it will change that much in terms of how we approach our work. I think what it will do is position us to be stronger and more solvent in the future. Again, YEP is very fortunate. We now have several layers of support and protection to buffer us against unintended consequences. We were fortunate to have a line of credit as well that hopefully we will not need to tap into. But this gives us one sort of level before that. If there is an opportunity that we see that we need to draw from our cash reserve, again, there's different variants in terms of how we set up our financial policies. There's only a certain amount that I can request the finance committee for that they can approve. Larger amounts need full board approval, and they want us to have a repayment plan. But this does give us the opportunity to not have to tap our line of credit, or as I think you said earlier, potentially, about not having to make a sort of emergency request to a funder. And we learned that the hard way during Hurricane Katrina, when we were only 1 year old, that if we had not had two very, very supportive foundations, we really had nowhere to turn at that point in time to make sure that we could keep our payroll and operations going. So I would say that for us, it really gives us the opportunity to strengthen our work, to move towards being a sustainable organization that will be here for many years to come. But I hopefully will be able to treat our board restricted fund more as an endowment than anything else. We actually have a corporate partnership with an investment firm here. Our board and finance committee have met with them, and so we have actually decided upon a portfolio within which we are going to invest these dollars and hopefully be able to invest for the long haul.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I'd like to turn it back to Ruth now, and we'll all come back online with our videos to participate in a little bit of a Q&A with the questions that Ruth has been accumulating from those who have joined us today. So Ruth, you are on.
Okay, now that was a wonderful inspirational story, Melissa. I love those kinds of stories. Well planned and relatively quick and not so very painless, and responsibility shared. How can you do better than that? So we got a lot of questions, so we're not even going to scratch the surface today, but I have two that I think were particularly important to people. One is, and we get this question all the time, and to say it depends, it only goes but so far, Hilda, but the question is, what's the recommended size for a reserve?
Got it. Yes, and I do say it depends.
Yeah. I think they want to know on what variables should it depend.
Sure. So we it's based on the type of business model. So for one, how quickly would you need to have this money? If you're emergency relief, it may have to be very quickly. In other cases, it's more for the long term. So we think 3 to 6 months is what's often written about by bankers and others. We realize 3 to 6 months is maybe sizable until you realize that that is a runway. It's if I really had significant loss in revenue, how far could I keep my doors open without impacting the quality of the program? So you need to decide what that is, and some organizations quantify it by saying, what are my core operating expenses that I would want to cover in a period of unexpected loss? And these other incremental costs I may do without. So how many months of those core expenses? At the end of the day, the way I usually conclude, it's what will it take for the executive director to sleep at night? So Melissa, you might have a different sleep tolerance or risk tolerance than another director. So what does it take for the director to stay strategic and not be reacting to the crisis of the moment? And that's the golden number.
So it's relatively different for each organization. And if an organization was to begin to think about this, would it be useful to think about, if the worst happens, if all the ATMs in the city are underwater for for a month, what do we need in order to operate? Of course, I don't mean ATMs. I know you guys are not going to the ATMs to withdraw money for your operations. We're hoping anyway. But to really do something that's very specific to your own organization, your liquidity needs, the needs of your particular business model, and whether or not you have buildings that have to be fed.
And I want to add to that, Ruth, and Melissa, thanks for mentioning the credit line, because I think the type of donor or the type of funder you do business with actually affects this calculation as well. If you do business with a government entity, for example, they are sometimes delayed in their payments. if you are embarking on a new program and you need upfront dollars. So it's also about the flow of the dollars so that you can use this as a what I call a flotation device and not have to incur the additional interest expense that comes with a credit line. Having said that, I think credit lines are an amazing tool and everyone should have one in running their organization. And I don't know, Melissa, if you want to add anything to that, just in terms of size or what you would say about that.
No, I think, again, we all hear that 3 to 6 months seems unattainable. So again, I would not dissuade folks from starting. And I think that even if you start, maybe you don't have the opportunity or a foundation like the Greater New Orleans Foundation that has this opportunity yet, but to have those conversations with your funders or even potentially with some of your individual donors who have the bandwidth and really truly are invested in your long-term sustainability to see if in fact they would be interested in maybe making a 10% additional gift next year, and you can there put that in even a savings account or a money market. And I think that there's other ways to do this where folks can feel overwhelmed with the thought of restricting any level of cash, but it's really about, you know, how we operate in our own lives. You know that you need to build a small emergency savings or you're going to be relying on credit, and eventually that can get you in trouble. And so I think, again, it's about being good stewards of money and really having these conversations with the donors who are most invested in your mission and most truly believe in the importance and value of the work that you're doing.
Okay, I'm going to bring up 2 more questions, and then I'm just going to hand it over to Hilda. We'll go a little bit over so she can go over some of the resources that we have for you. But I think this is probably from a fellow funder. Joanne and Kelly, what would you say were the 3 top things that attracted the donor to thinking about investing in endowments and reserves? What were those attractors?
The donor, the original donor, is a business person in the community. So the whole notion of efficiency, stability, and effectiveness, I think, drove thinking that an endowment would be that correct strategy and provide in perpetuity funding to sort of weather the ups and downs, you know, the things that Melissa talked about. But I also think that was set in stone several years ago, and the environment has changed. And the people on the current committee recognize that we're living in a different time with a lot more nonprofits in our community than when the endowment was originally started. And so the flexibility of the board reserve, I think, still met the donor's intent, but in a new and more palpable way and needed way for the nonprofits.
And I do think, Jeff, they were very heartened by some of the stories of how this fund was doing harm to organizations and not wanting, and in that way, not meeting that intent.
It's very interesting. There was a question in here, which I'm not asking now, which is, you know, what's the argument for endowments at this point? But we'll go on to that at another time. But the last thing I'd ask, also from Joanne and Kelly, what is the elevator argument for how reserves create impact?
Well, I think, as Melissa so aptly said, this is a way for organizations to start small and to begin to plan for the future and to begin to think about what is that flexible, even if it's $10,000, that's going to get us out of a pickle if something shows up that we need some money that we could tap into. I do think for leaders of nonprofits, this does help them sleep at night. I mean, it is that breath of, I have somewhat of a little bit of a safety net, and it's a fabulous way to get your board engaged in fundraising. And for them to understand their role in assisting you about thinking about these strategic financial decisions. So it's a great way to engage your board.
Kelly, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, we've been very struck by nonprofits sharing with us, those that had applied for the challenge and those that didn't, that this really elevated the conversation and created generative conversations among the board and really pushed them in that governance role versus what color of napkin should we have at the special event. And so just really elevated the questions they were asking, but also their understanding of their own business model.
That's great. Okay, with that, I'm going to sign off, but I am handing this over to Hilda, who's going to walk you through a couple of slides leading you to resources. I did get all of your questions, which were asking, can we see the readiness list? Can you please do a workshop about the workshop? And so we'll get back to all of you on that. But for now, I'm going to hand this over to Hilda.
Thank you. And so the next slide that we have here for you, in fact, are two resources that we think will get you started right away. The first is the Reserve Policy Guide, and we have created it here at FMA with the goal of walking you step by step through how do we create an operating reserve for the organization. So there is the live link that is there for you, and I really encourage you to take a look at this guide and share it with your board. And secondly, the next slide shows the checklist that the team members from the Greater New Orleans Foundation shared. This checklist is available. They have been nice enough to share it, and it's also on that link that we have here for you. In terms of other resources, just to remind you, Strong Nonprofits on the next slide is a website that has in the governance tab, actually before then we have two articles, Keeping It in Reserve. This article showcases examples of other foundations who have used reserves as a strategy for grant making. And then the last article explains the different types of capital that I mentioned at the beginning that will help you think through what are the different ways that I may require capital. Lastly, in terms of resources, we have the Strong Nonprofits website. If you go into the governance tab, there will be a bit more around reserves and the value of having those reserves. And lastly, on the last slide, we have some dates for the walkthroughs that we do at the site. I want to thank you for joining us today and thank our panelists. And again, I'm thrilled that we had so many viewers who will continue this conversation between the nonprofits, the work they do, and the funders that support them. So thank you so much and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
And thank you, Hilda. Bye.